Thank you for joining me for this Lifeway study of the book of Exodus and Leviticus. This is session 11. The title is Separation, and the text is Luke chapter 9, verse 15 through chapter 10, verse 3. The lesson summary statement is God established a way for sinful people to approach Him. I have a question written on the board that I'll have there when the class enters, because as we go through our prayer time and our fellowship time, I want them to see the question and for it to be working in the back of their mind. And the question is, can you name something that at first glance doesn't appear beautiful, but later you would see as beautiful? And just a few of the examples that come to mind is maybe a rattlesnake. At first, that doesn't look beautiful, but when you actually do look at that creature, it is a beautiful thing. Another is maybe Mother Teresa. She was not an attractive person physically, but what she did and the person she was made her a beautiful person. I remember the first time I saw my first child just after she was born, and I said she was beautiful, but she actually looked like an alien to me. But she certainly got beautiful very quick after that. All kinds of things. What are the things that they see at first glance not being beautiful, but later it is beautiful to them? Now, what you might look at the sacrifices in the Old Testament, and you look at quartered animal pieces and them being burned up, and you might ask the question, why is this beautiful to the Old Testament worshiper? And you could ask the same thing of the new Christian, the Christian worshiper from the New Testament about the cross, because the cross was a hideous thing in the first century. It wasn't even a word that they would use in polite company. But what we're studying is something that from our perspective might seem to be offensive and hideous. But to the Old Testament worshiper, it was something beautiful. And the reason is it was a way in which God made a way for sinful men to approach Him. Look at the beauty of this lesson summary statement. Notice it said God established a way. It was God that did this, not man. Man has tried to do this, and he has failed in every attempt. But God did this, and He succeeded. So it is a permanent way that's going to be, an eternal way that's made. Notice it's just one way. God made a way. The word a is a function word that's used with a singular noun. And so God made a way for sinners to approach Him. And so there's not multiple choice options. It's clear. It's certain which direction sinners can approach God. It reconciles the greatest division. Here is a holy God and sinful man, and God, He's the only one that could, made a way for those two to be restored and reconciled. I was listening to someone talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that's happening in our day, and they talked about the possibility there's a possibility that maybe one day they could live at peace with one another. More than likely not, said the commentator, but there is this remote possibility. There is no possibility for sinners and a holy God to live at peace with one another. But the beauty of this lesson is God made a way for these two irreconcilables, a holy God and sinful people, to come together. And it is beautiful. It's so dramatic that we adorn ourselves with the symbols of the way that God has made for sinful humanity and a holy God to come together. We wear crosses around our neck. It's so dramatic. It's so beautiful to us that we put crosses on our church buildings, and we put crosses on the walls of our home, because what is at one time was hideous is now beautiful to us. Now, since we're studying the book of Leviticus, this is our first lesson, there are some things I want to point out to the class, I'd like to ask them to turn in their personal study guide to page 9. And on page 9, there are the outlines that are given for the book of Exodus and Leviticus. And there's an outline that is from Warren Wiersbe, and I'm going to just briefly put it on the board for the class. But here are the 4 points to his outline. Number 1, a holy offerings, chapters 1 to 7. Number 2, a holy priesthood, chapters 8 to 10 and chapters 21 to 22. And then number 3, a holy nation, verses 11 through 17. And last of all, his 4th point, a holy land, chapters 18 to 20, chapters 23 to 27. And what I want to ask the class about is when you look at that outline, what is it that it communicates to you? First, it starts with holy offerings. That leads to a holy priesthood. That leads to a holy nation. And then last of all, a holy land. This is the way Wiersbe outlines the book. And so I'm wanting them to begin to see the point of this lesson as well as the point of the lessons to come. Before people can approach God, there have to be offerings, sacrifices made that atone for their sin. And then you have to have a prepared mediator in order to appropriately approach a sinful people. And so we have these chapters about a holy priesthood. And then that results in a holy nation, people coming to be set apart from God. And that has an impact upon the land as well. And so it's really a good book to think through when it comes to praying for a family or a nation or a church. We need to take sin seriously. The leaders need to be taking sin seriously and be prepared and to be godly and holy. And then that's what influences the people to be holy. So one of the things that we could pray for in terms of our nation is we could pray for the preachers to get holy and to take sin seriously. So just want to touch on that with the outline. And then in addition to that, I want to give them some key themes to Leviticus. There are 3 key themes to Leviticus. The first is the holiness of God. And a verse for that would be Leviticus 19:2, the holiness of God. He is the one who has the authority to instruct his people to make the demands for holiness, the holiness of God. Of all the qualities of God, the quality that is people are most aware of when they come into the presence of God is his holiness. Every other quality and character is saturated with his holiness. Isn't it wonderful to know that his love is a holy love? Number 2, the need for atonement. The need for atonement. The word atone or the word atonement is found 53 times in the book of Leviticus. It's only found 43 times in all the rest of the Old Testament. So Leviticus is the book that's talking about this great divide that separates sinful men from a holy God, and that God has made a way. It revolves around blood being poured out through a sacrifice. This is the key for atoning for sins. The third thing is the need for right living. The need for right living. Relationship with God invites right living with others. The second greatest commandment that Jesus quoted for us in Matthew 22 and in Mark 12, when a man asked him, what's the greatest commandment? He said it's to love God, but he married that to a second commandment, and he said it's to love people. And that comes out of Leviticus. Leviticus is, I believe I read, is the most quoted book in the New Testament. When children began to study the scriptures, the first book that they would study would be Leviticus, because Leviticus tells the people how to deal with their sin so that they can have a right relationship with God. And of course, that's all That's critical. That's essential. Now, one other thing I may do, suggest to you, is the Bible Project has a series of videos that summarize the various books of the Bible. The one on Leviticus is about 8 minutes long. It's well done. It helps explain how the Leviticus is put together, as well as the emphasis of Leviticus. And so at this time, I'm considering showing that 8-minute video. I typically don't like to show a video that takes that much time, but I think because it's Leviticus and people's understanding, their poor understanding of Leviticus, that might be valuable. After Leviticus, I want to get into the text. And the first point is separated. Chapter 9, verse 15 to 21. And I just want to read through the text and make some comments about it. Aaron presented the people's offering. Now, what's happened before is he's made offerings for himself so that he's acceptable before the Lord. And now this acceptable mediator before the Lord is going to make sacrifices for the people. And you can see Jesus all the way through this. He is the acceptable mediator who makes the sacrifice so that people can be accepted into the presence of a holy God. He took the male goat for the people's sin offering, slaughtered it, made a sin offering with it as he did before. He presented the burnt offering and sacrificed it according to the regulations. Verse 17, he presented the grain offering, took a handful of it, burned it on the altar in addition to the morning burnt offering. Finally, he slaughtered the ox and the ram as the people's fellowship sacrifice. And Aaron's sons brought him the blood, and he splattered it on the sides of the altar. They also brought the fat portions for the ox and the ram, the fat tail, the fat surrounding of the entrails, the kidneys, and the fatty lobe of the liver, and placed these on the breast. Aaron burned the fat portions on the altar, but he presented the breast and the right thigh as a presentation offering before the Lord, as Moses has commanded. Now, you have your study in your book, and there's all kinds of resources you can go to find out what each of these offerings were. But if you line them up, every offering is presented here, with the exception of reparation offering, and that's done individually. And it's almost as if they on this very first time, they want to get every offering done. But when you set these offerings off to the side in the meaning of it, the sin offering involves confession of sin. The burnt offering is an offering that involves an expression of wholehearted devotion because the entire animal is consumed in the sacrifice, and your studies will reveal that to you. Then there is the grain offering, and that's a thanksgiving offering, recognizing God's abundance to provide for people. And then the fellowship offering is a celebration. It's a peace offering, and so it has about a celebration. So what I want to put on the board for the people to see is we're talking about confession and devotion and thanksgiving and celebration. That's what's happening in this experience with Aaron offering these sacrifices for the people of Israel at that time. So here's how I want to apply it to the class. I want to ask them, what would it look like this week to live like a holy person? What would it look like this week to live like a holy person? How would that involve confession of sin? And I want to engage them in that. We may not take the time to ask the Holy Spirit to do the work of examining our heart to see if there's anything in us that is separating us from God or separating us from others. And maybe we just need to take some time, find some space in which we let the Holy Spirit speak to us about sin. It could be not just a confession of sin, it could be simply the embracing and the recognition that Christ's sacrifice has thoroughly paid for our sin. And then I just want to go to the second point. Living like a holy person this week would mean that we have a wholehearted devotion to God. The burnt offering, everything was given over to God. And so I want to engage them in that. What does that look like? And then thanksgiving, and then celebration and joy, those kinds of things. That's how I'm wanting to apply this first point. The second point is offering accepted. God established a way for sinful people to approach him. And again, I want to go through and make some comments about the passage. For example, the phrase lifted up his hands, it signifies that he is fully installed as the high priest. He has the authority to bless the people. It happens after they have been cleansed by the sacrifices, and he blesses the people. Now, we don't know exactly what he said in terms of his blessing, and some say that maybe what he did was found in Numbers chapter 6, verse 23 to 27. You may want to have your folks turn to that and read that. But it also signified that he was invoking and petitioning help from the Lord. And let me give you a couple of passages that would indicate something similar to that. One is in 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 22 to 23. Another is Psalm 28, verse 2. But he lifts up his hands. He's going to bless the people, and he's going to petition for the Lord's help. It says he lifted up his hands toward the people, and he blessed them. Now, this word blessed is found in Genesis chapter 1, verse 22 and 28. It's involved in that passage where it says that it's connected to God's command for the fish and the animals to be fruitful and to multiply and fill the earth. It's connected to humanity in the sense that in addition to multiplying and being fruitful and filling the earth, humanity was also to subdue the earth. So the word bless in the Old Testament meant that someone is endowed with power, such blessing that God would either see that they succeed or their life is extended or there is fertility. So when God blesses a person, what happens is that person does more than what they could do without the blessing of God. Now, the only source of this blessing is God. Others can bestow the blessing in his name or with his authority, but the source of the blessing from Scripture is from God. So he's asking them to be blessed. Someone said that what it means to be blessed is anything that draws us near to Jesus. That's a blessing. Anything that causes us to relinquish the temporal and hold more tightly to the eternal. That's being blessed by God. Anything God gives us that makes us fully satisfied in him. That is the blessing of God. Now he goes on in the passage and he says he came down after the sacrifice, after sacrificing the sin offering, the burnt offering, and the fellowship offering. Moses and Aaron then entered the tent of meeting, and when they came out, they blessed the people, and the glory of the Lord appeared to all the people. So they go in together, but when they come out, Aaron is involved in this responsibility of being a mediator. Verse 24 says, here's what happened. Fire came from the Lord, and secondly, consumed the burnt offering and the fat portions on the altar. And third, when all the people saw it, they shouted and fell face down. The fire demonstrated God's acceptance of the people's sacrifice. Now, fire in many passages in the Bible symbolize the Lord's presence and the Lord's work. An example would be Exodus chapter 3, verse 2, and Exodus 19, verse 8, and there's other passages. But sometimes the fire demonstrates God's judgment. And an example of that would be Malachi chapter 3, verse 2. And so here it is conveying God's acceptance of these sacrifices. Notice it says they are consumed. It doesn't say they were burned up. The sacrifices were there on the altar. It was going to take some time for those sacrifices to be consumed. But this fire from God immediately vaporizes these burnt offerings. It was a way of saying again that these offerings were acceptable before God as atonement for the sins of the people. And notice the outcome of the people. There is this fire symbolizing the holiness of God and the purifying, cleansing power of God. There is this consumption of the sacrifices, his acceptance of the sacrifice for the atonement of their sins. And then there is this worship. Notice these two aspects of their worship. They shouted and fell down. Now, the word shout is a word that conveys a shout of joy over the work of God. It means to give a ringing cry or to shout for joy. And this is the first time this word is used in the Old Testament. So there is this hilarity, there is this gladness, this joy that rises up in the hearts of people when they recognize God has accepted their atoning sacrifices. But on the other hand, there is this falling down on their face. There is this reverential fear and devotion that's demonstrated in their worship. It does have an element of fear. I do know it means reverence, of course, and it means awe, but just imagine the people. They're standing there. We're reading it. They saw it. Fire fall from the heavens and consume those sacrifices. And their hearts are filled with joy that God has done something about their sin. And yet, what kind of a God are we dealing with here? So there is this dual part to it, joy and an awareness of his holiness and a reverence and a soberness, taking God seriously. Now, I want to try to apply this in showing how this kind of sacrifice is to be demonstrated in our worship today. I want them to go to Luke chapter 7, verse 36 to 50. I'll read that. It's the story of the woman who brings the alabaster jar and she pours it out upon Jesus, anointing his body for his upcoming crucifixion. And she's criticized by it, and not only for the waste of it, but she's criticized for the kind of person that she is. And so what I want the class to talk about is what did that sacrifice cost her? Now, it obviously was a monetary sacrifice, and you can go into background expressing that may have been a family heirloom that was set aside for the anointing of maybe her own body when she died and was buried, and she gave that, so it was very expensive. But there was fear of a woman going into that context where the men were, and she overcame that fear. There was the scornful cynicism that people had about her act. There was her vulnerability. Those are the kinds of things I'm saying is when it comes to an offering that accepted to God, when it comes to a genuine act of worship, what are those things that we have to deal with? That's what I'm driving at in that passage. Another passage I want them to see that when we come to God in worship, it involves sacrifice. It's Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. And there, we're to present our bodies as a living sacrifice. And the point of it is we're to live different lives than the world. And so, what does that look like for us? As Christian people, what do we sacrifice that makes us different than the world? And that's what's happening. That's what I'm wanting to make this application. These people, when they saw that God had accepted them and their sacrifices, they were overjoyed. But it also resulted in this very soberness, serious, taking God very seriously. One last passage is Mark chapter 12, verse 28 to 34. And the point that is driving at there is that an acceptable offering is loving my neighbor. So what I'm trying to do with the classes, I'm trying to help them see that this was a worship service, and this worship service had a deep, deep impact on the way they lived and the way they thought because of their view of God and their experience with God. Sacrifice looks like submission to God as He renews my relationship with Him I sacrifice my sin, and I renew my soul, my relationship with him. That's what I'm driving at. The third point is chapter 10, verses 1 to 3. And it's a holiness scene, and it's this awful story of Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu. Nadab's name means volunteer or willing. Abihu's name means whose father is he? It could be a word of testifying about authority, living under authority. So before I get into the text, here's the question I have for the class. And I put this on a piece of paper with the words real large so that the class can see it. Here's the question. What actions do you consider disrespectful or inappropriate in social circumstances? What actions do you consider disrespectful or inappropriate in social circumstances? Many years ago, at the end of a Sunday evening service, Darrell, a really fine guy, I love Darrell. He's now in the Lord's presence, redheaded guy, retired truck driver, just a wonderful guy. But boy, he made a beeline to me after church on Sunday night, and he contained himself, but he was really charged up. He was really upset because there was a teenage boy that came to church that night, had his baseball cap on, and he left his cap on during that time. And he was wanting me to say something to that young man and correct him. And so we had a talk and so forth. And I think I calmed him down and helped him to understand that young man did not mean anything like what he and I grew up with, and it being disrespectful. But it was what he viewed as a disrespectful or inappropriate action in that circumstance at church. So that's what I'm asking. What is it that people come up with? What would be some of those kinds of things? And belching at the dinner table. That might not be appropriate for your family, certainly not appropriate for mine, but those are the kinds of things. And we'll have some fun with that, I'm sure. And then I want to read through this statement and give some explanation for it. For example, the phrase unauthorized fire, there are lots of suggestions about what that could possibly be. It could be the fact that they didn't go to the fire at the altar that God started. They got another fire. It could be they didn't use the incense that were specially prepared to be burned in the holy place. It could be, we just don't know what the exact meaning is of that, but the bottom line is God didn't sanction it, and they didn't care, and they simply disobeyed what they clearly knew was the right thing to do. Also, it says here, it was not which he had not commanded them to do. They did what was expressly forbidden to them. There were no, they should have known there would be consequences. For example, they came together to offer incense. Only one person was to offer incense. That was the high priest. The first fire was started by God. They used apparently some other kind of fire. The high priest had a fire pan that was specially designed and had been set aside. They used their own fire pan. These men did what they did what was expressly forbidden to them. So I just kind of go through that. One of the things that's interesting is Moses said to Aaron in verse 3, it's almost as if Moses steps in to prevent Aaron from doing something or saying something that would have gotten him judged. And basically what Moses said is God's judgment has always existed and he is acting consistently. We should not be surprised. Here's how I want to apply this. When people stray away from God's demands for holiness, what effect does it have on their lives and their relationships, both with God and with others? When people stray away from God's demands for holiness, what effect does it have on their lives and relationships, both with God and with others? There are many examples in the news that you could use, and I no doubt the people have personal examples of that. And the Bible's filled with examples. Achan in Judges chapter 7, he does expressly for what is expressly forbidden, and God takes his life. Uzziah, when they're moving the tabernacle, the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem, he does exactly what he's told not to do. In fact, they're transporting it in a way that they were told, you are not to transport it with a cart. And Uzziah is struck dead. Ananias and Sapphira in Acts chapter 5. And I'm sure there are other examples in the scriptures that you could use. There are consequences when we choose to not follow God's holiness. Now, to close the lesson, I'm going to ask them to turn to page 108 in the personal study guide, or I have made a sheet, and these are the application points for this Sunday. The application for point number 1 is our sin creates a barrier between ourselves and God. You have those, and I'm wanting them to see all three of them together. And I'm asking this question: how do these relate to one another? When you read all three of those application points, how do they relate to one another? What do they have in common? And I'm wanting to take it back to this lesson summary statement that it's, in one way or another, it is pointing out that it is God who has established a way for sinful people to approach him. And I'm wanting to use this as a way to talk more deeply about the lesson and make an application of it. And then I'm going to ask them, would you take note of that in your book, or take this sheet and make comments, write down the comments that some of the people have. And this week, give some thought to these 3 points again in light of this lesson. If the devout Jewish family found this book to be the most important book that their children need to learn when they began to study the Bible, then there's something here for us in our day and time. And it is the fact that God has provided a way for folks like us, sinful people, to approach him. How beautiful a message that would be. God bless you. Thank you for being a part of this study.